Hi everyone, it's Charlene with Tranquil Tuesdays, and today we're going to talk about cooling down with hot tea, which does sound very paradoxical, I understand. But in this video you're going to learn why it's not. So to do that, I'm going to make some green tea, some hot green tea. So I'm going to start. First I'm going to heat up everything. And I have made a video before about 2 mistakes to avoid when making green tea. So if you want to just refresh yourself on kind of like the basic primer of making green tea, I would suggest watching that. Okay. So I warmed up everything. And before we start making the tea, I'm going to just talk a little bit about what these ideas of cooling down with hot tea are rooted in. So this concept of cooling down with hot tea is something that's rooted in traditional Chinese medicine, which is an ancient practice in China and actually developed concurrently and around the same time that tea was discovered. So the mythological, pseudo-historical legend of how tea was discovered was from 2700 BCE by a figure named Shen Nong, who is a pseudo-historical character credited with discovering tea as well as discovering Chinese medicine, and his name itself means sacred farmer. So I think it's important to note that when tea was first discovered in Chinese culture, it was considered a medicine. It wasn't considered a fun beverage to laugh over the gentry with, which is what it evolved to in Chinese culture. But in the beginning, it was considered a medicine. So I think that is important to acknowledge when discussing how it intersects with Chinese traditional medicine in these different principles. Okay, so in Chinese traditional medicine, there are 2 principles. I mean, there's one rubric for looking at food and how it interacts with the body, and that is foods that are heating, 上火, and foods that are cooling, 去火. And I'm going to just leave that there for a second. I'll just talk more about that, but let's just start making the tea. So I warmed everything up. Now I'm going to add some tea. Oh, I have some Mao Jian green tea, which is a toasted green tea, Chinese. This one's from Zhejiang. I'm doing this by eye, but if you watch the video I mentioned before about 2 mistakes to avoid when drinking green tea, I talk about the specifics and the proportions, but I'll also try to write it in the comments. The water here was heated to 185 degrees, but it's been out for a little bit, so it's probably a little bit lower, probably closer to 170 by now. But I'm gonna leave this out for like a second just to, help get rid of some of that heat. And then we're gonna do a quick rinse just to, warm up the leaves, get them primed and ready to release their flavors. Like I said, stretching. So it's just like in and out. Okay, so I'm gonna dump that. And then now I'm going to actually steep it. And I really want to pay attention to time. Time and temperature are the 2 key things to making a really good cup of hot green tea. The temperature, like I discussed, was pretty low, and I just want to focus on making sure I don't oversteep this tea. So I'm not going to try to talk about anything else while we do this. I guess you're going to just watch me watch this pot of tea, but it's actually not that long. I think that's good enough. It might be a little bit too short. Well, I don't know, the color looks okay. Okay. I'm gonna try it. I'm a little concerned that it is a bit light. I might have done it too short in my desire to not oversteep, but we'll find out. Yeah, it was a little bit too light. Still pretty good though. Still tastes a nice flavor. And I would say too light on your first steeping is still better than over steeping or burning it. So back to this idea of heating and cooling. So it's about, if you want to think about this not as in temperature, it's not like heating and cooling in terms of hot and cold temperatures. It's a more holistic way of thinking about how food interacts with your body and how it makes you feel. I think the closest analog is to a concept that is familiar with Americans is how people discuss inflammatory and anti-inflammatory foods. I feel like that is a concept that's discussed pretty widely in wellness health circles now. And that's, thinking about foods and how they make your body feel inflammatory, anti-inflammatory. And I think that is a pretty close concept to this idea of heating and cooling 上火去火 foods in Chinese medicine and Chinese culture and culinary culture, it's still a concept that has a lot of currency today. It's not just an ancient concept. It's something that people regularly talk about. So this idea that hot green tea could be a 去火, a cooling item, is something that exists underneath that understanding. To learn more about this, I actually wrote about a blog post about this extensively a couple years ago, and I had invited a Chinese medicine practitioner and acupuncturist I know, Heidi Lovey, to contribute. I'm linking to that post below, but I will just briefly say some of the concepts that she shared to help illustrate this idea of heating and cooling. So she says one way to think about it is really, the concepts are grounded in how foods metabolically interact with your body. And she has two good examples. She's like, if you take a cold jalapeno out of the refrigerator, its temperature is cold, but if you eat it, it's hot and warming, right? That's the experience you have. It's a hot food. And another example is if you have an Altoid or a mint gum and you're chewing it, you experience this cooling sensation. So it's sort of thinking about those ways you experience food to better understand this concept of 上火去火, heating and cooling foods. So, and then she elaborates that in traditional Chinese medicine, natural tea, unprocessed tea, is considered cooling and something that was used in traditional ancient medicinal applications. And because green tea, like white tea, are the most minimally processed teas in the whole spectrum of different teas, they are considered the more cooling teas. Which means not all hot tea is cooling. I know, it's very confusing. Green tea is, white tea is, but black tea is considered actually a warming tea, and oolong depends, and pu'er is tricky. So it is complicated. But if you are interested in experimenting with this idea, you're open to exploring this concept of drinking a hot tea to cool down, I would say find a green tea that you like, or a white tea, and try that out. I know it's sort of a very abstract and very different way of thinking, but it's cool to try it out and experience for yourself how you might feel drinking a hot tea to cool down when it's hot outside. And if that is just not for you, you can look at last week's video again about how to do cold brewed iced tea and just stick to that. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next week.